Look, I want to kill the spider.
I can help you get Batman.
You want to kill the spider.
I'm not the one you want. You want Spider-Man.
Together, he doesn't stand a chance.
I propose a pairing.
Interested?
Or at least that's how most movies tend to go. Villains in general are very hard to get right. They have to be evil, but not just for the sake of being evil. They have to be disliked, but also loved by the readers. They don't usually have a perspective, but they need enough screen time that we understand their motivations and their characteristics. So writing multiple villains can seem a bit, well, daunting. Hollywood has this common theme that when they release a franchise, usually by movie 2 or 3, we expect to see multiple villains being added to the film. They believe that bigger is better, and I actually have an entire video on how that's not the case right here. But we will see this in movies like Spider-Man 3, Pirates of the Caribbean 3, Amazing Spider-Man 2, Batman Returns, Batman Forever, and then Batman and Robin started adding more heroes to counteract all the villains. Those were really weird movies. None of these movies actually benefited from their multiple villains. They actually probably would have done better if they had one villain and focused on their motivation and characteristics instead. This doesn't mean you can't have multiple villains though, if your story calls for it. Plenty of stories does this well. You have Percy Jackson, Avatar: The Last Airbender, The Legend of Korra, Harry Potter. So I asked myself, why did the great movies work, and why did the others fall a little bit flat? And here is what I've learned. Just as a disclaimer, I will be talking about these movies here, probably in some pretty good detail, so if you haven't watched them, spoiler warning. Chapter 1. Knowing when to add an extra villain. We're actually going to start this whole thing with when not to add an extra villain. This is the problem in Hollywood. Don't add a villain just to raise the stakes in your story. The ending to Spider-Man 1 and 2 felt like higher stakes than the ending to Spider-Man 3. They both had one villain compared to the 3 that was in the last movie. Just as a side note, I just realized that Mary Jane Watson is like the stake in all 3 of those movies. She is the person in danger that Spider-Man has to save.
Hang on, Mary Jane! Hang on, Mary Jane! Hold on, Mary Jane!
Why? If you're thinking that your conflict is a little less dramatic than you want and you want to amp up those stakes, instead of adding a villain, change up your plot, change up your villain himself, change up your character. Add limitations to your character's abilities that makes the ending much more impactful and dramatic instead of just piling on villains for your hero to fight. Okay, 2. You should add an extra villain if the conflict you plan goes against your current villain's character. At the end of Season 1 of Avatar: The Last Airbender, the conflict is that the Fire Nation is attacking the Northern Water Tribe, and they end up killing the Moon Spirit to take away the Waterbenders' powers. That sentence must sound really weird to anyone who hasn't seen that show. We know that Zuko is the main villain of the season. He's been hunting the Avatar since episode 1, but we've seen from Zuko's perspective, he's been built up as sort of a decent person. He doesn't want to hurt people or take over a whole continent. He just wants to get his honor back. If he was the one who led the attack and killed the Moon Spirit, it would have gone completely against his character. So instead, we have our second villain of the season, Admiral Zhao. He's kind of a psychopath, and that's established earlier in Season 1. Acting rashly and killing the Moon Spirit doesn't go against his character at all. So in doing this, you can still have the plot you want while keeping the main villain who you want them to be. You might want to add a villain if you have multiple conflicts that your hero needs to go through, or if you have multiple main characters that also have to go through their own personal conflicts. Stranger Things Season 4 uses both of these. Eleven has to overcome her own papa and finally decide that he doesn't want what's best for her. But she also has to face Vecna, a man who has this connection to her and is trying to kill her friends. But we also have multiple main characters dealing with their own villains. Max and her team are dealing with Vecna in their own way, but across the world, Hopper and his team are dealing with the Russian government that now have Demogorgons. Two villains can also be used to show two different sides of a conflict. They're usually put there to show the protagonist that neither side is right and that the protagonist must forge their own path. We see this in Mockingjay, when Katniss realizes the rebellion she's been fighting for is no different than the old government she's trying to tear down. In Season 1 of Legend of Korra, Amon is the main villain, representing the non-benders of the world, wanting to take away bending forever. Tarlok is a water-bending councilman who wants to take control of the non-benders and even starts arresting them unjustly. Tarlok and Amon represent two opposite sides of a conflict, and Korra's journey in this season is seeing that benders are out of control, but Amon's tactics are too severe. She wants to stop the evil equalists, but she doesn't want to arrest all the non-benders to do it. As the Avatar, she has to find the balance, and facing both of these villains helps bring that to light for her. Sometimes you might just want to have two villains because your main villain is so mean and scary that they raise stakes too high to be brought into the middle of the story. These would be like your Dark Lords, like Voldemort, Sauron, Silco. The fight between Harry and Voldemort has to be saved for the end of the book, so we need other villains to overcome in the meantime. This is why we add villains like Bellatrix, Draco, Saruman. When it comes to writing multiple book series like that, it's good to have those minion villains for your hero to fight before they fight the big bad at the end. And maybe you have a completely different reason that I didn't list that you might want to add multiple villains to your story. Personally, I think having multiple villains makes your story feel a little bit more realistic. Realistically, your hero is never just going to fight one villain their entire journey. Adversaries are going to pop up here and there and cause your hero to struggle in different ways. Chapter 2. Have your villains be connected to one another.
We're like brothers, only closer.
So you have decided that you do in fact need multiple villains in your story, but how do you make them all work? You can see stories try to do this by saying villain 1 walks up to villain 2 and says, "Let's team up and fight the bad guy." But this doesn't really work. This is a very weak connection and usually leaves the readers unsatisfied. This is because realistically, two villains aren't just going to team up because they hate the same person. They each have their own motivations and their own ideas of what's right and wrong. So who's to say that Sandman thinks that what Venom's doing is completely in the right? It just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. To make both villains feel realistic and compelling, you're gonna need a real strong plot connection between the two. Just as a side note, I'm not talking about what I like to call episodic villains. These are the villains that kind of come into play for one episode or two. They have nothing to do with the ending plot of the story, and they're just there to kind of fill the time. These villains are like Jet from Avatar: The Last Airbender, Draco from Harry Potter, or even Rhino from Spider-Man 2. But I am talking about end-of-the-story villains, those villains that we lead up to throughout the whole story and end up defeating and have a resolution to by the end. So how do we add real connections? 1. Same side, different level. This is probably the most common one. This is your Dark Lord and Evil Minion scenario, like we talked about before. This is your Lord Voldemort and Bellatrix. This is Emperor Palpatine and Darth Vader. This is Sauron and Saruman. This is Silco and Savika. Both are usually working for the same goal, but may have different motivations or skill sets. Obviously, when you have a Dark Lord, he or she isn't going to be fighting these smaller battles, so we need to have lower level minions to play that part. Or maybe the Dark Lord is just a burning, all-seeing eye, so we add a more physical villain to fill that void. It's hard to go wrong with this, but I do see a lot of stories make the minion villain have the more personal relationship with the hero.
I am your father.
But I feel like this could hinder your main villain if you aren't careful. Bellatrix kills Sirius Black, Harry Potter's godfather, and laughs about it. She burns down the Weasley's house, and she straight up tortures Hermione. We have all of these reasons to hate her and to want to see her defeated, but Voldemort doesn't feel the same way. I feel like some of these scenes should have been given to him so that we could hate him in the same way, so that defeating him felt that much more satisfying. 2. They are each other's antagonist. I find these types of stories really interesting. It's when you have two separate villains, and they're both against your protagonist, but they're also against each other. It's like you have this weird love triangle thing, but it has nothing to do with love. It's a hate triangle? Yeah, it's like a hate triangle. They're working against our protagonist from two different sides, but they're also working against each other. And in this case, we get to see our heroes struggle and overcome obstacles and change as people, whether that be for the better or for worse. This is why Zuko and Zhao work so well. They are supposedly on the same side from Team Avatar's perspective, but Zhao doesn't want Zuko to find the Avatar. He wants to kill the Avatar himself. He acts as Zuko's antagonist, standing in the way of what Zuko wants.
I've been hunting the Avatar for 2 years and
And you failed. Capturing the Avatar is too important to leave in a teenager's hands. He's mine now.
He takes Zuko's men and ship and leaves him deserted. And this brings a whole new perspective on Zuko. Suddenly we feel bad for Zuko and kind of want to see him succeed even though we know he's our main character's antagonist. This kind of dynamic can bring up interesting questions, like is anyone actually a villain or are we just working for our own personal goals? Does the villain have motivations that are justified or have they gone too far? In Legend of Korra, Tarlok and Amon end up being brothers, but they are completely against each other's ideas, yet their ideas come from the same place. They both want to control people, one by taking bending away, the other by using bending to enforce his laws. You can see that having opposing villains can bring out the good or worse in each other, making us almost root for one of the villains to win. 3. The Umbridge. This one was a difficult one for me to figure out. If you've seen Harry Potter, you know that Umbridge is one of the most iconic villains in his story. Umbridge doesn't kill parents, she doesn't torture innocent women, she doesn't even kick puppies, but she is so hated. She is, for all intents and purposes, on the good side. She is placed in the school and in the story to keep Harry and the other students from learning the defensive magic they need to learn to beat Voldemort. She doesn't do this because she's on Voldemort's side, she's just ignorant and believes that students are trying to raise an army against the Ministry. She refuses to believe Harry, punishes him for being honest, and finds joy in keeping order, whether it be from firing teachers or punishing children. But she's not working for Voldemort, and she's not working against Voldemort, so how is she connected? I racked my brain over this, so in Percy Jackson and the Sea of Monsters, there's a new head camp counselor, Tantalus, who's just horrible to Percy and forbids the students from leaving the camp. But he feels more like an episodic villain. He's only really in the first half of the book and has nothing to do with the main plot of the story, which is when it hit me. Umbridge is connected by plot. She may not be working for our main villain, but she definitely stands in the direct path of our hero from learning how to defeat his main villain. Because of this one fact, because she was placed into the school to specifically keep the kids from learning defensive magic, she feels relevant. She feels important. We now know that we have to defeat her in some way to be able to defeat Voldemort. If you erase this one part of her and still leave in all the other cruel things she does, she will still only feel like an episodic villain with little importance. What's one annoying teacher compared to a Dark Lord? Unless that one teacher stands in our direct way of defeating that Dark Lord. If you know of any other villains like Umbridge, please leave them in the comments below. I am dying to see more villains like her. I scoured the internet, books, movies, comic books, anime. I was just looking for someone else who has that same aspects that Umbridge does, and I could not find anything. So if you do, like I said, leave them in the comments. I will read it, watch it, play it if it's a game. Send it to me. Umbridge is just iconic. That pure hatred that you feel when you see the blood on Harry's hand and then her little smirk afterwards, and then the joy that you feel when she's drug off into the woods by the centaurs.
Tell them I mean no harm! I'm sorry, Professor. I must not tell lies.
She's amazing. Do keep in mind that just because you have your second villain connected to your first villain doesn't mean that your second villain is perfect yet. You still have to give your second villain compelling motivation and flaws just like you did with your first villain. I'm going to use The Dark Knight as a bad example, but before I do just want to say that The Dark Knight is a fantastic movie, okay? Joker is one of the best villains I've ever seen, and I can say for a fact that Dark Knight is my favorite DC movie. But Harvey Dent was unnecessary. You could say that Harvey Dent and Joker are connected because Joker basically created Two-Face by blowing up his girlfriend and then blowing half his face off. But why do they not work? First of all, I think one of the big problems is that Two-Face didn't have much screen time. He was only in the last third of the movie, and yes, you could argue Harvey Dent was throughout the whole movie, but there was a clear character change between Harvey Dent and Two-Face. and we just didn't get to see much of that because of the limited time. 2, his motivations felt wrong. Yes, Gordon was the one that was supposed to save Rachel and he ended up failing, but Joker was the one who pulled the trigger. It was his fault, and yet Harvey just decides to side with the Joker and kill Gordon instead? I just don't buy it. And maybe there was this underlying motivation to what Harvey did, and like I said before, because he didn't have much screen time, we didn't really get to know that part of Harvey Dent, or Two-Face in this case. Not to mention that this scene, even though it is amazing because Joker was fantastic in this movie, it is just a play on the same villain walking up to villain and saying, hey, join my team because of this random reason. Now, 3, and this is the most frustrating one for me in this movie. Harvey's purpose was to be the symbol of something that was good, turned bad because he had one bad day.
That's how far the world is from where I am. Just one bad day.
But the ending conflict between Batman and Joker was that Joker was wrong. The city of Gotham chose the better path. So why contradict that satisfying ending with this Harvey turning bad metaphor? This doesn't mean that Two-Face was a bad villain. He just didn't really fit this plot. And let's be honest, with a villain as iconic as Joker, did we really need that second villain in this movie? So back to the first question. What have we learned? You might need to add multiple villains if your current conflict needed goes against your villain's character. Your character needs to resolve multiple conflicts, or you have multiple characters with multiple conflicts. If you have 2 different sides to a conflict and need your character to choose neither side, or if your main villain raises the stakes too much to be a common threat. To make adding multiple villains to your story satisfying, you need to connect your villains by same side, different level, placing both villains on the same side but having them be on different levels of authority and having different skill sets. Each other's antagonist, having your multiple villains be each other's antagonist while also being your main character's antagonist. And the Umbridge, placing the secondary villain as the main obstacle between the protagonist and the main villain. There are plenty of other ways you can connect your multiple villains in a story. I just listed off my 3 favorite and most distinct that I've seen in my favorite movies, but if you still have questions and you're still wondering how to add more villains, or I didn't touch on a topic that you thought that your story relates to, then go watch some movies with multiple villains in it. See what they do good, see what they do bad, what do you enjoy about having multiple villains in a movie, and what do you hate about having multiple villains in a movie. And then dissect those and figure out what makes them work. This is what we do as writers. We take things that are great and we put them in their own stories and we make them better. Or at least that's the hope. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun writing this script and doing research for this. I love villains and I love stories. Make sure you guys like and subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and hopefully I'll see you guys next time. Okay, I'm done. My voice hurts.